Imperium is a book by Robert Harris, published around 2006. It's about Marcus Tullius Cicero, statesman of Rome. I'll do my best with the names. It's a little hard to keep them straight and get pronunciation correct. At certain points, it's easy to admire Cicero, and at other points it's easy to see him as a sneaky, slimy politician. I suspect that no matter when this book is being read, it will seem to apply to the current political situation. It seems that technology has changed quite a bit since Cicero's time, but human nature may not have changed much. It turns out that public speaking is still very important. The book seems to be mostly based on historical writings, although I suspect in some places the author took some artistic license. There are 3 books in this series, and they're all written from the point of view of Tiro. Tiro was Cicero's educated slave and secretary, and so you get to see everything from Tiro's point of view and be a fly on the wall. Tiro invented a special shorthand system that I believe influenced many shorthand symbols used today. The early part of the story, Tiro follows Cicero because he wants training in public speaking. He seems to realize early on how important public speaking is going to be for his career. So Cicero travels to Greece and Asia Minor and works with many different teachers. Eventually, his most important teacher is a guy named Molon, and he has him march up and down hills to practice speaking while, doing something strenuous. He has him walk back and forth in front of the ocean, trying to speak over the sound of the crashing waves. This is to imitate whispering in the Senate Hall. And at one point, Cicero gets a bit frustrated and says, shouldn't I be focusing more on getting good at argument, having, cleverly thought out argumentation methods? And Molon doesn't seem interested in this at all. He says, the content does not concern me. Remember Demosthenes. Only 3 things count in oratory: delivery, delivery, delivery. This may seem a bit cynical, but it turned out to work pretty well for Cicero, and I suspect it still works pretty well for politicians today. If you want to learn more about Cicero's clever public speaking tricks, you might check out a great courses lecture called Persuasion and Propaganda in Ancient Rome, Cicero's Oratory, which is by Gregory Aldretti. One trick is, if your opponent makes a really good point, when you respond, instead of responding to the argument, make some kind of joke about their appearance or their gestures, or say something insulting about their spouse. Another important trick is to get people to chant something. And it's even better if you can make it rhyme. For example, if the glove does not fit, you must acquit is a modern example of this trick. Another trick he uses to great effect is to pretend to be a friend or relative of the person he's arguing against. He can pretend to be their long dead great-grandfather and then take on the persona of that character and use it to insult and belittle the person he's attacking to get the audience to laugh, to get everyone on his side, regardless of the content of the argument. Cicero also learned that the bigger a crowd is, the stupider it is. And whenever you're trying to impress a big crowd, you should always invoke the supernatural. One of the things that Tiro realizes during the course of the story is he thinks the Stoics were wrong. Reason is not the most important thing, emotion is, especially in politics. Molon, the public speaking instructor, gives Cicero another piece of advice. When things are going well in your speech, that's the time to sit down and end it. It sounds a little bit like the modern quip about ending on a high note. Cicero understood that as long as he convinced the audience of the strength of his own beliefs, that was much more important than actually having good logical argument or facts. Cicero also learned the power of xenophobia to galvanize the citizens' pride because this would flatter them. Another thing Cicero realized was if you're going to do something unpopular, don't do it halfway, go all the way. Cicero realized that perseverance, not genius, takes you to the top, and over the course of the story he had many setbacks. A little side note, when Cicero was younger he visited Syracuse to find the tomb of Archimedes. He cleaned up the tomb and sat there for a while and meditated on life. And an interesting note is that the tomb was marked by a cylinder and a sphere. One of the personality traits of Cicero is that in some ways he could be a bit cowardly and squeamish. And for example, he would avoid the gladiator games and was often accused of being a draft dodger. When Cicero has perfected his public speaking, he attempts to run a practice as a lawyer and get into politics. He needed a lot of money to run for the Senate, and Cicero didn't have it, so he married Terentia. She's described as a flat-chested, unattractive woman who was also a rich slumlord. Terentia also turned out to be a wise counsel and a sounding board for Cicero's plans. Early on, Cicero took on a difficult case to fight corruption in Sicily, and when he was successful, this allowed him to climb higher and higher as a politician. And it also led to him having a good reputation as a very effective lawyer. Some important politicians that Cicero meets early on that carry on throughout the story and the other books as well is Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome. And Cicero meets him after he's finishing up fighting the slave revolt of Spartacus. When Cicero meets Crassus, he's talking proudly of how he's figuring out the logistics of crucifying all the slaves on the road back to Rome and carefully spacing them out. Crassus and also Pompey, another very wealthy general involved in putting down the Spartacus rebellion, argued a bit over who should get more credit for putting down the Spartan rebellion. Pompey, or Pompey the Great, ends up being an important character later on in the other books as well, and he and Crassus are constantly fighting for who will get more of the credit for great achievements in the military. Cicero also knew Julius Caesar, and he actually recommended that Caesar study under Molon, Cicero's own public speaking coach. This might be something Cicero come to regret later on. Cicero's friend Atticus told him an important lesson. Never underestimate a half-wit who is an ambitious politician. The example here is the drunken debauch Hybrida, who seemed like an incompetent screw-up, but ended up teaming up with Crassus, Catiline or Catilina, and others in an attempt to overthrow the Roman Republic. Another important character in Cicero's story is Catilina, or Catiline, who's described as tall, given to a violent temper, but he had the ability to be generous and loyal to friends, and to get the common people on his side. He knew how to get along with a wide range of different people. He was popular with the general people because of his vulgar behavior, but he was also popular with aristocrats because he was one of them. There were stories that he'd done terrible things while he was ruling in Africa. He had raped a Vestal virgin and been acquitted of it, and he had gone around raping and stealing and murdering and torturing. When Cicero refuses to represent Catiline in court, they become enemies, and this decision will follow Cicero for the rest of his life. At one stage in the story, Tiro thinks that maybe Julius Caesar planted the seed of an idea in the mind of Pompey. And it was an idea to make a big deal out of a pirate attack and use this as an excuse to put all of the power in Rome in the hands of one man. You can think about this kind of like declaring martial law, where you suspend civil rights for an emergency situation. Desperate times call for desperate measures, this being seen as the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. So the attempt was made to put all the power in the hands of Pompey the Great, who again was a very wealthy general who had the command over lots of veterans. Initially, Cicero helps Pompey to play the old trick of Cincinnatus. There's a story of Cincinnatus being the unwilling hero. You may have seen this in movies where they go and find the old retired hero, and he says, no, I gave that up a long time ago. And eventually they convince him to help them. Well, this is a story of Cincinnatus, and Pompey plays that part to convince the public. By the end of the first book, Cicero has managed to temporarily thwart the plans of the conspirators trying to take over the Roman Republic. By this point, Cicero had climbed to a very high political position and gained a reputation for public speaking. Tiro notes that there are no lasting victories, only the moving forward of events. Tiro admired Cicero because he often did the right thing, despite his fear of what would happen. Cicero had made many enemies and decisions by this point which would haunt him for the rest of his life.